Thanks, Larry. Yeah, today I'm just going to be reporting on some of the stuff that I did for my master's under the supervision of Professor Michael Schleier at ORI and also Dr. David Glassam at UKZN. I realized I'm doing a talk very late in the day, so I thought I'd add in a bit of humor. Going back to 1992, there's me as a little kid. Mark, I do note that this is actually 1 year before you started your monitoring photos. So you should have given me a call to come help you with your sampling. But yeah, nevertheless, my dad got sick and tired of me begging to get some scuba diving equipment. So he decided to get me a 2-liter Coke bottle and a hose pipe, stuck it on my back and threw a coin in the pool and said, "Off you go, boy, go fetch, you're a diver." As you can imagine, that didn't work and I was flapping like a duck. But I've come a bit since then, and I did my master's with ORI, and luckily we had a much better equipment set up there. My passion is coral reefs, and some talks have mentioned already on what comprises a true accretive reef. True coral reefs are predominantly found within the tropics, and they are accretive in that they grow towards the surface. But in South Africa, it's not the case. Mark mentioned we're at high latitudes, and because of that, conditions are marginal for coral growth. So what we have is we have a different type of setup here, where our corals grow on a thin veneer, or grow as a thin veneer instead of growing towards the surface. Melita this morning also mentioned on how a lot of phase shift has been occurring around the world on different reefs. This is becoming a big issue, where frequency of disturbance events have created a phase shift from from coral-dominated reefs to macroalgal-dominated reefs. And in my study, I looked at a key ecological process that's involved in maintaining coral communities, which is coral recruitment. I'm sure you guys can imagine or know that being a sessile individual, corals don't have an option of packing their bags and shifting down the reef if conditions become unfavorable. Instead, they rely on the introduction of new individuals to colonize new areas, predominantly through reproduction, which can happen in one of two modes. Majority of corals are broadcast spawners, where they have the external fertilization of their gametes in the water column, or some corals are brooders, where they have internal fertilization. Regardless of the mode, you have the development of a larvae that then disperses in the water column. And as mentioned earlier on, this can be as long as 3 months, which has been reported with some corals. But what actually happens is when the corals comes time for settlement, it's actually a highly selective process. And the literature is showing that crustose coralline algae plays a functional role in settlement. So this was one of the aspects that I looked at in my master's. Once corals settle, they then need to survive those conditions and continue the cycle by reaching reproductive maturity. But the problem is they're so small when they settle that studying the early life history stages on the natural substratum is an extreme challenge. Corals are often only able to be detectable by the human eye as much as 6 months after settlement. So what we do is we put down artificial settlement surfaces, which then can traditionally be retrieved for microscopic analysis, where you can see what is settled and what your recruitment rates are like. My thesis had two key components, a methodological component and also an ecological component. My first aspect, I compared coral settlement onto different settlement surfaces, addressing the selectivity issue of coral settlement. And I also investigated a rapid in situ technique to detect baby corals and combat that issue of only being able to see corals on the natural substratum as much as 6 months after settlement. I then looked at the dynamics of recruitment on Two-mile Reef, and I looked at the spatial and temporal variation of recruitment as well. I used three different settlement surfaces, ceramic tiles, which are pretty much the traditionally used settlement surface in recruitment studies. I used marble tiles because they're comprised of calcium carbonate, and some studies have reported that dead coral skeletons are favorable for coral settlement as well. And marble tiles as a commercially available alternative with calcium carbonate. So I wanted to see if marble would end up resulting in higher levels of settlement. I then looked at locally abundant crustose coralline algae species, a mesophyllum species, by conditioning ceramic tiles with the species of coralline algae in the research aquarium at Ori. And these were all attached to the reef at 3 different study sites on Two-mile Reef. And at each site are attached tiles onto concrete structures to enable their anchorage onto the reef. And I attached each treatment in a stratified sampling design so I had sufficient replication. I had the tiles down for 6 months over two 6-month sampling periods. And before I retrieved the tiles, I took fluorescent photos of the top surfaces of tiles. And then when I came back and did the microscopy, I could then have a look and see how effective the fluorescent photography was at detecting recruits. Just some of the results that I found from a settlement surface side of things. I found that there was a difference in settlement onto the 3 different surfaces. There was a significant difference. But surprisingly, the species of coralline algae that I had conditioned the tiles with did not significantly enhance recruitment. This is found or supported by some stuff in the literature where they found that even though coralline algae as a functional group are being found more and more to be suitable surfaces, it is species specific, with some species of coralline algae, which I found later on, such as my one, to tend to outcompete recruits. From a dynamic side of things, we saw a lot of spatial and temporal variation in settlement. A lot of recruitment ended up happening at the northern study site during both sampling periods. There was a clear differentiation between settlement that occurred during this summer 6-month sampling periods and the winter. This is supported by the literature where our reproduction predominantly, does occur during summer, and the winter sampling is pretty much composed of postloprids, which could possibly be brooders, which I'm addressing in my PhD thesis. So we found a significant difference between the 3 different study sites, as well as wireframes, so the concrete structures nested within study sites. And this supports some of the work that Van Oor's been doing, where he's been showing that settlement could happen in waves, and it can actually happen at very small spatial scales. When I looked at the microhabitat selection of settlement on the tiles, on the right-hand side is an image there of the concrete structures that I've been using. And the fluorescent photography had a limitation in that I could only photograph the top surface of tiles. But if you have a look at the left-hand side, the tile template there, oh, there you go. Yeah, if we have a look at the tile template over there, I've used GIS to map every single recruit that I pretty much had settle on tiles. And you find that those are the sides of the tiles that have been flayed out. And you can see that the majority of settlement actually happened in the microhabitat or the edge surface that was created by the concrete structures. So what we did then is, or since then, we've or if I just note on the effectiveness of the technique quickly, I found that the fluorescence photography consistently underestimated recruitment or overall settlement that was recorded with microscopy. So what we did is we tried to enhance the amount of settlement that happened on the top surfaces of tiles by creating a new tile design and by creating grooves and trying to mimic what was actually happening on the edge surfaces due to the concrete structures. We were hoping that we would increase the microhabitat surface and result in a shift in the spatial pattern of settlement. And surprisingly, we did find that. We found that if you look on the left-hand side, which is the standard tile that I'd used, you can see that the majority of settlement, once again, happened on the edge surfaces of tiles. But as soon as we put grooves on the top surface of tiles, the microhabitat spatial pattern shifted, and we had more of a uniform surface. This is yet to be, the fluorescent photography is yet to be tested on the new tile design, but that's probably going to be happening in the next few months, probably. If we look at the recruit composition side of things, coral recruitment was dominated by postloperid corals, and this is classic for settlement studies. Postloperids are considered pioneering species, which tend to have very prolific reproductive events and high levels of settlement. The post-settlement survival is questionable, which unfortunately I did not quantify in my study, but is something I'm going to be looking in my PhD by looking at juvenile recruits on the reef. But what we found is that there was an absence of acropores, which settled during the winter sampling periods. So to conclude, from the methodological side of things, the different settlement surfaces did play a significant role in overall levels of recruitment, and the species of coralline algae that I worked on did not significantly enhance settlement. The fluorescent photography was effective at detecting recruits as small as 1 millimeter in size, which is a real amazing find, considering that these are definitely not detectable by the naked eye on the reef. But it did tend to consistently underestimate settlement. I'm proposing that it is a good method to do qualitative stuff rather than quantitative, but we're going to be investigating that further. From a dynamics, settlement also showed spatial and temporal variation on Two-mile Reef and was dominated by postloperids throughout the year. I'd like to thank the following organizations and people for their help with my study. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Justin. Any questions for Justin? We've got time for a few. No, you're not a plant, are you?
Justin, what you're showing there is definitely the north area of Two-mile Reef is very important, right? I'm finding that as well on my genetic connectivity, that there is a break point on between the north and the south. You think, why is that?
I think it's a combination of factors. I think it could possibly be a scenario like you were proposing. It's a first case of nice reef that the larvae are finding, and they're deciding, let's settle, and you're having high levels in the area. But I think it has also environmental variables, like the fact that our northern site was actually a deeper site and wasn't on the reef top community that was found at the central and the southern site, which I predict is, well, which did have higher levels of water movement and can result in reduced levels of settlement. I think, in essence, that the environmental variables could have accounted for that spatial pattern that I found.
Any more questions? Tim.
Thanks, it's a very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask, in terms of, I suppose, within the different species, the time in the water column of the larvae varies greatly. But what is the sort of range in terms of the Two-mile Reef, for example, that species found there?
The thing that it's been an exciting challenge that I'm tackling now. As I mentioned here, it's focused on settlement, and if you go back to the life cycle, I'm taking a loop back, and in my PhD, I'm looking at the gametogenesis and the release of larvae. And we're going to be doing quite a bit of work in the field to collect larvae to find out exactly when our corals are reproducing, how much they're reproducing. And with that, I'm going to be able to answer questions like that by having the larvae to see how long they can survive for. And it's going to tie in. Fanor and myself are going to be working quite a bit together. We're going to be looking at the genetic side of things as well. I'm trying to relate on the settlement patterns on tiles. Are all of those recruits that are on tiles very closely related, or are they coming from different parents, different reefs, etc.?
One more question? Right, fantastic. Thank you, Justin. Cool. Thanks.